Sorry that I'm starting this marathon a little later, folks. I literally just had to deal with the crappiest day of trying to get to this house after missing my flight earlier yesterday. And so now that I'm here and we can begin the spring marathon, let's get started. Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2. Now, the story of Lords of Shadow 2 follows a tale of Gabriel Belmont, also known as Dracula or Dracul as he calls himself. And he follows himself through many centuries of losing his powers after his castle being attacked so long ago by the Brotherhood of Light, the organization that he once worked with. And during this time frame of when he wakes up in the modern era, his whole castle has been basically leveled and built upon its foundations is this new modern city. And of course, an old acquaintance of his, Zobek, comes over and says, "Hey, I have an offer for you." They basically saying that, "Hey, you remember the same guy that you basically took care of at the end of the first game? Well, he's kind of coming back. And, can we have your help a little bit and say, can you stop him again? Like, we need to stop his acolytes before they destroy the world and all that good stuff." And so Dracula agrees to say, like, "Look, I will deal with you. I will deal with Satan's acolytes and potentially Satan himself if it comes to that, if you can guarantee me my eternal rest." And so they make the deal, and of course, Dracula has to go out and find these acolytes to figure out where they are and to basically hunt them all down before Satan returns. Now, the gameplay in Lords of Shadow 2 is a little bit different from the first Lords of Shadow, not in terms of the actual weapons and mechanics of how you move about the world, but how you progress through the game, and saying that while the first Lords of Shadow was fairly linear and throughout the environment and just going from point A to point B, Lords of Shadow 2 presents more of an open world aspect and saying, like, you basically have two settings throughout the course of this game. You have the modern day city and you have Dracula's castle. You can move about them as you wish, and you acquire more powers. You become more able to access different parts of the castle as well as different parts of the city. And so you can travel back and forth between these at any time through specific locations just to make this a little bit easier. And by the time that you figure out all the powers and try to figure out, you can pretty much go anywhere that you please in terms of the environment. And that's probably the only major difference in terms of progression through the game, not so much mechanics, because like the first Lords of Shadow, you have your basic set of weapons, you have your light attacks, your heavy attacks, and so on and so forth. But you also have a couple of different weapons, and each of them feel cathartic and satisfying in their own right. Through the three main weapons, which is the Blood Whip, or I think it's the Shadow Whip. I could be incorrect about that, I apologize. Which is, of course, as you would expect, a whip-like weapon that can be used for light attacks, heavy attacks, and etc. As well as the Void Sword, which allows you to potentially freeze enemies, and I will admit it's a very effective weapon. As well as the Chaos Claws, which are basically fiery gauntlet fists. And of course, it makes me feel like a Zora's Wrath whenever I can basically throw a barrage of fists at my enemies. And each of these weapons have their own upgrade systems through which you fight enemies and build up a focus meter, and the more combos you can get across these enemies without being hit, the more orbs you can get for your focus, and that way you can upgrade your weapons even more. But there's another catch to this, in saying, like, the more you use a certain type of move, the more it is able to be upgraded. And by the time you basically fill up a certain move slot, that way you can upgrade the weapon further and the attack further, and making the weapon even stronger. So while you will have weapons that might seem fairly weak at the beginning of the game, by the time the game concludes, you're basically fully decked out in terms of all your weapons and powers, and you can have so many cathartic feelings, like such as, oh, I don't know, how does the idea of summoning a giant cyclone blizzard with a sword sound? Or basically slamming your giant flaming fist into the ground and causing a volcanic eruption to occur right under your enemy's face. I don't know about you, but I could find that pretty satisfying. And the presentation for Lords of Shadow 2 is absolutely gorgeous. I love the whole dark gothic setting that they were having for the castle. I will admit the city itself came off as a bit, I don't want to say generic, but uninspired. There really wasn't anything aside from potentially Dracula's castle or any one particular location in the city that made me it is large in scale. There isn't much in terms of actual design, in terms of features that made it all that memorable. Whereas the castle, there's each a distinct section, and I still remember those even days after playing this game, and so I have to give it credit for at least that. Another thing that really impressed me on a lot of levels is the score itself, particularly with two themes, Dracula's theme and the Siege theme, both of which occur in simple, quiet moments as well as a large, grandiose scale, with the Siege being one of my favorite almost battle themes I've come across and boss battle themes that I've come across in recent memory, as well as the idea that the Dracula's theme, the way it presents itself and the way it kind of fits his character perfectly, in that the piano, it's played so slowly, but you get the sense that it has a sense of tragedy to it. It's so quiet, and you can feel a sort of quiet resentment in him. And one of the most interesting things of this game itself altogether, and probably the biggest draw for me personally, was the idea of playing as Dracula himself and getting to know him. Now, I will admit, the first Lords of Shadow game surprised me with its twist of how it became that this character becomes Dracula and who he ultimately is. And I found that example of storytelling to be very, very tragic and effective. And whenever you see Dracula at the beginning of Lords of Shadow 2, you can see his, I guess you could call it sarcastic, cynical nature towards people who are of trying to be of a religious, how do I put this, religious conviction. Dracula himself, I can't help but realize that while he is a vampire, while he is so-called the Prince of Darkness, you do understand where he's coming from. You understand his frustration and the fact that he's kind of been screwed over since the beginning, and his cynical nature is understandable. And not to mention, whenever he feels like he wants to try and make up with his family, particularly his son, Trevor, he kind of acts like an actual father figure. In fact, they even do this through gameplay, where there's one particular segment where you have to protect Trevor from these enemies who are trying to kill him, and he is very protective of his son. And I was like, wow, they actually make Dracula sort of a father figure. They see him interact with him, and that's something I never thought I'd actually see. And it was interesting. It was something that and despite the fact that he is a vampire, he's still a person. He's still a character, and I love seeing that. All of this together made for me to personally what I would consider a very, very interesting interpretation of Dracula. I won't say it's the best one, because I will admit I have not seen many incarnations of Dracula and how he's been portrayed over the years, but this, from what I was able to deduce, is a very interesting portrayal of him as a character. And one of the biggest criticisms I've heard about this game ever since its release is its ending. Now, I will admit, the ending sort of caught me off guard a little bit at first, but then I started thinking about it and trying to see, like, okay, why did they try to make this ending, and try to rationalize it or try to deduce on a fundamental level, does this work or not? And I came to the conclusion saying that while I admit it might not fulfill the fans' expectations and be as this satisfying ending to progress in this particular manner, I will give Konami and I will give Mercury Steam credit for not repeating the same ending as the first game. And so, while I will say I do understand people's frustration and that it doesn't give you the ending that you want, it at least doesn't try to copy off the first game exactly. It does actually create a little bit more of a tense scenario when you have to face the particular enemy that you have to fight. And so, with that in mind, I do respect Mercury Steam, the fact that they could have easily gone this one particular route to fulfill fans' expectations, but in the end, that satisfaction towards the fans might have actually backfired in Lords of Shadow 2's favor by saying that while it is satisfying on that level, it's pretty much just copying off the first game. So which poison do you prefer? Do you prefer an ending that doesn't try to emulate the same thing the original did and ends up trying to be somewhat a little bit different in terms of the way it concludes? Or do you basically just copy and paste the ending of the first game and say, like, okay, we had this one boss fight at the end of Lords of Shadow 1, we're going to do the same thing in the sequel, just to make sure that we give fans what they want? I mean, either way, someone's going to lose. So you either go for the one that involves more risk, or the one that's way too familiar, and people are going to complain either way. Now, my bottom line comes down to this: the weapons very cathartic to use, a lot of progression in terms of power and catharsis with each of the weapons, and you want to test out every single one of them. You have to use them to their full advantage, and it makes you actually curious to see what in the world their maximum power level is. Dracula is portrayed in a very three-dimensional manner to make him not only a sympathetic figure, but one you can understand why he is the way he is, and the resolution that he has at the very end of why he comes to the conclusion or takes the certain action that he does. The presentation itself, while very beautiful in the castle, it looks very dark and gothic, and it fits the tone of Dracula himself. And even with that, the locations for him when he goes back to the castle are fairly unique. The presentation in the city itself is a little bit lackluster in the fact that it's not very memorable. I can honestly not remember a single major location within the city itself. And so that in regards is not something much within its favor. And the final thing I would have to say is that the score is unbelievable. It fits the tone perfectly, and it also makes it feel both tragic and very grand in scale in terms of what Dracula has to do, in terms of what Dracula is feeling, in terms of the tragedy involved with him, and overall it just made the atmosphere of the game a lot better and a lot more effective than it would have been without it. So with that all into consideration, I would have to say that Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2 is worth playing, but not perfect. I will admit, the game was ultimately satisfying in terms of what I was expecting or what I was anticipating, but I can understand if a lot of people disagree with me and saying that, look, it just didn't meet what I was ultimately hoping for. So, in regards to many people disagreeing with me, I'll just have to learn to accept that. So until next time, everybody, I'm Perry the One-Armed Legend. You name it, I can play it.